It is just now going on 5 o'clock in the evening on Monday, September 14th. And today I'm going to be starting off with my continuation of my reread series for the Thirst series by Christopher Pike. I have the second and third books being used for prompts for the Bookoplathon, which if you watch my weekend reading vlog that I posted here actually today as I'm filming this, you'll know that these are on that TBR for separate prompts. Black Blood, which is book 2 in the series, is being used for my fourth role, which is to read a book that's set in the present. And when this book was first published, this series was first published, the setting was a contemporary setting at the time. Now, the books themselves were published back in the 90s, so it's basically 1990s. You could, though, argue that they still could be in even modern day, like 2020. So I think that it still works, even though there are vampires present in the story. And then Red Dice is going to be for my sixth role. It was one of my extras, one of my doubles I had over the course of my playing of Bookopoly, which I had a community chest card that basically was a prompt that had the prompt short book, which all of these books in the Thirst series are, at least for the first like 6 or 7 books, maybe like going on 9 books, are less than 200 pages each, which for me, that's a short book. I think that I typically think of like a good standard book size is like 350 to 400 pages. So these ones are definitely going to be the ones I'm going to be working on. I'm going to have separate videos for both. So this video is going to be specifically for book 2 in the Thirst reread series, which is Black Blood. Now, if you did not watch my review for The Last Vampire, I would ask that you go and check it out, because there is going to be a little bit of spoilering going on in this video as to what happened in The Last Vampire, because in order to talk about this book, I have to go into what exactly happened in the last book. So if you, though, would like to skip the spoilers and still watch the rest of this video and get some of my general thoughts of what I thought of with the second installment, I will leave a timestamp in the description, if I remember correctly, that will basically lead you to the point where I actually get started with the real review and reading vlog-esque stuff. But Black Blood basically is about set right after, I believe, the end of The Last Vampire, which in the end of The Last Vampire, we saw not only did Alyssa turn her boy toy Ray, who she believes is a reincarnation of her first husband from when Alyssa was still a vampire. She's turned him into a vampire, and she believes that she's killed off Yaksha, who is the vampire, the demon vampire, basically, that turned her into a vampire 5,000 years ago. And I believe that Black Blood is basically supposed to be right off of the end of Last Vampire, but now that Alyssa and Ray are kind of on their own, doing their own thing, there seems to be a lot of gruesome and grisly deaths happening that could only be happening by other vampires. The only thing that they can think of that would actually be causing these murders, and it leads Alyssa to believe that Yaksha wasn't very truthful in the fact that he supposedly had killed off all of his spawn. So The Last Vampire, for those of you that might need a refresher if you're actually watching the spoiler part, is that in The Last Vampire we learned that Alyssa is a 5,000-year-old vampire. She was turned when she was about, I would say, probably around the ages of 16 to 18-ish, and she's basically from like the Aryan race that happened thousands and thousands of years ago. And in her little town, a demon child was born that was Yaksha, and he was infatuated with her, and he wanted her to marry him and turn into a vampire. She gets stolen away by him one night, and she ends up being turned into one of the first set of vampires that start traveling the world, kind of thing. And then in the story, they meet Krishna, who is kind of the Hindu version of Jesus Christ, as far as I'm concerned. And he basically says to Yaksha that he will be in Krishna's grace if Yaksha just never makes another copy, he never makes another vampire of himself, and if he goes and kills off all of the ones he's created, which includes Lissa. And Krishna also tells Lissa that, who was then named Sita at the time, he tells her that if she never creates another vampire, she will receive his grace as well, which we find out later on in the book that she doesn't creating another vampire because she turns Ray into one to save his life. So she's a little apprehensive as to what exactly is going to happen, because now her faith is a little shaken up, I think, because she doesn't believe that Krishna is gonna want his grace thrust upon her. I don't quite know what the correct verbiage or phrasing of that would be, as I am not of Hindu religion of any kind, but I thought that the first book was really crappy. I was really disappointed in it, so I'm not very hopeful with what this next one's going to be. I'm actually kind of nervous because I feel like it's going to be more of the same, considering that all of these books were pretty much written, published in like the 90s. So I just remember that the last book of the series really messed me up. And already from the very beginning of this series, it's not proving well. So I'm very nervous. But again, if you would like to hear more of my thoughts on the first book, The Last Vampire, go check out that review because it will give a lot of information about why exactly I rated this book so low, at least the first one, The Last Vampire, because I rated it 2 out of 5 stars. I'm willing to bet that Black Blood and Red Dice will probably be the same. Because they're not the kind of stuff that we would see anymore, is really, I think, the best way to talk about it. Is it's not something we would see anymore in contemporary literature. Black Blood was my July read for the third series. I just never got around to it. And then Red Dice was my August read, and I also didn't get around to that. And so then, because I knew the Bookoplathon was happening, I tried to incorporate them in the TBR to try to read both. I also may have another reading vlog set up for the next book after Red Dice, which is called Phantom. That is book 4. I may have another reading vlog for that one because that one is the September read for this reading series. But it will also then depend on what all I get through this month, because I have my Bookoplathon books that are priority, and the book like Night Shift, that is kind of a back burner book if I end up finishing up my reading goal every day before the end of the day kind of thing. So Phantom will kind of more likely be something like that, where if I get through my reading goal for the day, I'll pick up Phantom when I get Night Shift finished up. Hi guys, so it is, I think, going on like 4:20 in the afternoon. And it's been a very nice reading day, like during the day over the course of my breaks and stuff. I've been able to get to my goal fairly early in the day for Thirst, for Black Blood. I'm on chapter 11 right now, so I only have like 5 chapters left until the end, so it should be fairly easy tomorrow for me to get this finished. So far, the way that the story's building in Black Blood is kind of better than how The Last Vampire was. It's still not really like the greatest thing that there ever was in writing, but I will say that I think that overall the story is better in the second installment than compared to the first. The few things though I want to address are that the voice of Sita is incredibly inconsistent, and that the kind of events of the story just still go by way too quickly. I feel like this is one of those series where, like, again, yes, it was written in the 90s, so I think that that has a huge place in it, because I think that back in the 90s it was more common to see books under 300 pages. That was kind of the norm. So I think that anything you'll see back then in regards to like young adult literature in particular is going to be a lot shorter. So I kind of appreciate how years later we got like the bind ups of like 3 books in one, because it definitely was something that I think the first 3 books could like be put together, that kind of thing. As far as the voice of Sita, with it being inconsistent, there's just so many points in time where Sita uses so much of her more formal voice and then randomly starts calling, like, instead of calling somebody a man, she would call them like a guy. And yeah, that may have something to do with the fact that her vernacular has kind of changed over the course of time, but I feel like it would be better just to stick to one kind of way of speaking. I feel like if you're going to write someone who's like 5,000 years old that has really kind of grasped the ever-changing vernacular, that the voice would remain consistent in the sense that you know, in present day, they would speak a certain way. But then, like, if you were to have a flashback, they might have a little bit of a different voice depending on the time period. I just feel like the constant back and forth of more formal versus more casual, like, modern way of speaking, it's just very disjointed, and it feels very jarring to where it kind of pulls me out of the story a little bit. To how I felt with the first book, with the weirdness that I felt with the Hindu mythology placed into it. There's not much of this put into this book. There is a scene that we do see Krishna again after Sita goes through a fairly traumatic experience in this book, but it's pretty much the only time that he's ever brought up. He's mentioned in passing with Sita talking to Ray about some of the experiences she had when she starts to tell Ray about some of the things that she experienced when she was first a vampire, when Yaksha was around, things of that nature, and when she met Krishna for the first time. But we only see him so far at this point once in an actual scene of the story. Now, I think that that leads into my idea of, like, there's not really much to do in terms of my opinion about the Hindu placement of this in the story. I still think, you know, it does make sense considering the past of Sita and where she came from, but I'm still hesitant to say whether or not it's good representation, because I'm not Hindu myself, so I can't really say whether or not the adaptation of Krishna in this makes sense. But again, it's one of those things where, like, I'd have to do more research on that to really get a good grasp of whether or not I think that he would be adapted well in this story. The one thing, too, I feel like does bring some negativity down to this book is, I think, just in the way that Sita and Ray's relationship is. I feel like it's just not working for me. I think that because the first book made me have such a bad taste for the relationship itself, it's carried over into this book, and I just don't really get it. Like, I understand that Sita sees Ray as like a reincarnation of her first husband from when before she was a vampire, but I'm still reeling from the fact that in the first book she basically seduces him and he's just totally fine with it, and then completely forgets the fact that, you know, he had a girlfriend, he had a whole life before Sita came around. Because in the beginning of this book, there is a scene where we see Ray literally sitting outside his old girlfriend's house, and he's lamenting about how, you know, upset he is that he, you know, had to go the way he did. And it doesn't make any sense to me. It just feels so forced, and the interactions between him and Sita are so forced, because I feel like there's so much resentment from Ray for Sita, but he still loves her. Like, it it doesn't make sense to me, and I feel like Rey should not have been a love interest in any regard, because truthfully, I think Sita is not really a person that needs a love interest. I think she's just a badass character by herself, and she doesn't need somebody there, but that's my opinion on it. I mean, any young adult story anymore has like almost an obligation to have a romance, which is kind of ridiculous. But again, like I said, this was written in the 90s, so the standards were very different in terms of what to expect with like young adult or maybe even new adult literature. What? Okay, guys, it is going on 3 o'clock now on Wednesday, September 16th. I'm taking a short break from work because, as you guys saw, I finished the last chapter of Black Blood. So let's go into more of the review. I will be doing a little bit of spoiler-free stuff, and then I will later be doing a spoiler-filled. So we'll start with the spoiler-free stuff. Okay, so Black Blood is basically the second novel in the Thirst series, as I've said. This basically picks up right after the events of The Last Vampire, where at the end of that, Sita and Rey are basically, you know, left on their own. They have had about 6 weeks since Sita's house basically blew up, and Yaksha is pretty much considered dead. Sita doesn't believe that he could have survived that blast, and unfortunately though, as she's traveling around LA, she is finding out that there is this group of vampires that are fairly new, like they have probably been created within the last several weeks. And considering that she thinks she's the last vampire that there ever is in the world, that doesn't seem to be right, because the only person she created was Rey back in The Last Vampire. So she's not sure where these vampires are coming from, but is starting to think that maybe Yaksha didn't necessarily really die at the end of The Last Vampire. So the whole story is basically her and Rey trying to find out what exactly happened, where these new vampires are coming from, and what exactly this means in terms of what the world could come to if these vampires continuously start being created more and more as time goes on. Throughout a lot of this book, too, Sita also starts to battle with her faith and battle with the thought that her god, Krishna, basically the Hindu version of like Jesus Christ, basically, she starts to think that, you know, he has forsaken her, that he is no longer going to be giving her his grace because of the fact that she basically transformed Rey into a vampire when she was not supposed to. And she just is having a very, very hard time with believing that she's meant for anything else in this world other than to now hopefully live the rest of her, you know, immortal life with Rey, who she believes to be the reincarnated version of her first husband in her previous life before becoming a vampire. So going into some of my thoughts on it, spoiler-free wise, I think that, like I said earlier, this one was actually slightly better than the first book. I'm still giving it 2.5 stars because I think in a lot of ways there has been some improvements with this overall story, but it's still not really that great. For one, the writing style is still very inconsistent. Like I said before, the voice of Sita is very inconsistent because it kind of goes from talking more casually to talking very much more formally. Along with that, I still have a lot of issues in terms of her relationship with Rey. I feel like this one, in terms of the development of the relationship, there's not really a lot of development other than the fact that Sita does tell Rey some more things about, you know, how she kind of was when she was a vampire, when she was first turned, and her conversations with Krishna and all these different things. But the relationship itself doesn't really develop, and I can't say why until I get to the spoiler part, because things happen. Now, in terms of the bad guy that is involved in this story, it is actually somebody that is fairly random. We don't really know anything about him. We just know he is somebody that somehow got turned at one point, and now he's kind of going after Sita because Sita is obviously the most powerful vampire. This guy knows that Sita is one of the oldest vampire there is now, and he is going after her to be able to absorb her power, basically. But we don't really know much else about him other than just kind of the idea that he's trying to be the biggest, baddest vampire that there is. In terms of the length of the story, I think that similar to how I felt with The Last Vampire, the length is way too short. I, again, think that combining the first 3 books into one large omnibus is the way to go. I wish that that was originally what had happened with this story, because I think in terms of the overall story, The Last Vampire and Black Blood specifically really seem to work well together as like one big story. Like, you could have had it where these 2 books were one big book, and I think it would have turned out a lot better. Maybe just changing out some of the scenes between The Last Vampire and Black Blood, like the ending scenes in The Last Vampire and the beginning scenes of Black Blood, kind of changing those up a little bit to make it a little bit more of a seamless kind of transition between part 1 and part 2 kind of thing. I just don't understand why these books were so short, but again, I think that's because back in the 90s, that may have been kind of the norm, was to have books under 300 pages, more like around 200 pages or so. And then I think just in general, the story itself is, developing in a way that I like. The ending, though, was kind of weird. There's another character that comes up in this book named Joel, who has a kind of, I don't even know, like, it's not even a fling, like, they don't even have a fling, but Sita's kind of attracted to him, and he plays a bigger role towards the end of the story, and something happens with him that I can't really divulge, but it made the ending very confusing. Like, it almost kind of ended at a point where it wasn't exactly a cliffhanger, but the ending was just so abrupt that I literally, as you saw, it was just like, what just happened? I think in terms of, like I said, just the progression of the story, again, this is a little bit better than how the first Vampire was, but not really by much. It was very, very slim differences, I think, to where it made it a little bit more enjoyable. And I think that just kind of seeing Sita, talk more about her experience with Krishna and some of the conversations that she had, and also the testing of her faith. I kind of liked that a little bit more. I think that added a lot to her character and her story that made the story a little bit better, but pretty much everything else I felt the same as what I did with The Last Vampire. Okay, so I'm going to now go into some spoilery thoughts on this. So if you do not want to be spoiled for this book, please go to the timestamp that is down in the description, because I'm going to get into some things that I really, really disliked that would spoil this book. So see you at the end of the video if you do not want to be spoiled. First things first, still really hate Sita and Ray's relationship, and it doesn't really seem to change much. Like I said in the spoiler-free section, seriously, it's just nothing changes. And then Ray dies, and I'm so confused because he didn't have to die. He basically made himself as like the sacrifice, like he's supposed to be the savior of the day. It made Sita go into this really weird spiral. This is where she kind of started to question a lot of her faith, because she thought that with Krishna's grace, she was going to be able to live with Ray for the rest of her immortal life. And she didn't even get to be with him for more than a year. And it was such a stupid way to bring up Sita's faith questioning phase of her life. Like, I don't understand how or why that thought was a good idea. Going into the next love interest that we're going to be introduced to, Joel. He is an FBI agent and is tailing Sita, and that's basically what my whole what with the ending was, because he, like a cop does, he follows around Sita, he tries to figure out what is going on with this case or whatever, and he gets himself in trouble, gets himself hurt, to the point where he's nearly dying at the very end of the book, and then Sita decides to turn him into a vampire now, because of reasons that we don't understand. She basically has this split decision kind of thing where she wants to save his life, but she's like, Do I love him like I loved Ray when I turned him? No, I'm gonna turn him into a vampire anyway. And that was where I was kind of just like, excuse me? And that's where the book ends, is her turning him into a vampire. And I was so confused. I don't understand why that was a good idea, because look what happened to Ray. Do you really want to have that happen again? You don't even really know this guy. You don't really even like have any feelings for him other than the fact that you thought he was attractive. And then at one point you were kind of like, you know, I would be fine with having him as a lover when you're with fucking Ray still, like, and he's alive and he's sleeping. Like, oh my God. So a lot of the questionable things in this book made me really dislike it, because Sita, it seems to be so smart, but she makes some of the dumbest decisions, and I feel like it's because this author has written her to be kind of like this stereotypical seducing woman where she just thinks anyone and everyone she can just sleep with and have no consequences to it, and it fucking irritates me so much. And then another thing is with Eddie, who is our bad guy. So he's the one that is the vampire, and the only reason he's around is because Yaksha apparently didn't actually die. Yaksha did get severely injured, but basically what happened was when his body was taken to the morgue, Eddie is the guy who worked at the morgue, and I don't know exactly how. He's got some kind of weird fetish kind of thing where he makes what are called snuff films, which are basically videos, I think, of like women specifically being severely hurt and raped and tortured and all these things, and he creates them. And I don't know what exactly went through his head, but somehow he knew that Yaksha was a vampire and decided to basically siphon off his blood and use it to create himself into a vampire, and then he creates other vampires through that process as well. I don't know what the end game was for him. I don't know why he decided to do this. I don't know how exactly he knew that Yaksha was a vampire. Like, none of that is explained. None of that has gone into. It's just Eddie was like, hey, that's a dead vampire. I'm going to siphon off his blood to make myself super powerful. And then I'm going to go after Sita, who is this other really powerful vampire who has way different powers and is way more powerful, and kill her too and siphon off her blood so that I can become the most powerful vampire there is and make a bunch of copies of myself by, you know, turning other people into vampires, basically. So I don't know. The logic there was not there. It was completely missing. Like, I don't understand anything about Eddie, and we never really got any ideas to why he does what he does. And I want to say too that there is a little bit of a trigger warning for incest, because there's something going on with him and his mom. Don't know much about that. Didn't really go into it very much, because probably it would have been very gross to hear about anything that happened between him and his mother. But yeah, so slight bit of incest there. But nothing of this book really made sense. Like, the whole logic of the book was just completely non-existent. And so how exactly is this even marginally better than The Last Vampire? I don't know. I think I just enjoyed it slightly more than I did The Last Vampire, but I'm so confused, and so many things that were in this book were just wrong or didn't make sense. So now that the spoilery part section is over, those are all of the thoughts that I have on Black Blood by Christopher Pike, the second novel in the Thirst series. Thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you enjoyed it and you watched the end, please let me know with a comment down below. Otherwise, leave a like on this video if you did enjoy it. And I'm excited to see what kind of happens now with Red Dice, kind of considering how that one went. But I'm also still I'm just really confused with the whole thing. Like, I don't understand. A lot of questionable things with that one. If you guys haven't already though, and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owl in our flock, and I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys.